course of a theoretical study, like Tesla engaged in these things. Can you do this? Can you do that? It was sort of a mental challenge to him. A, can you make an object invisible? B, can you get free power from nowheres? He was quite successful at B, to the chagrin of some other people, and of course that aspect of the work he did was later buried. And he did other things of this nature, many different projects, for the sheer sake of trying to do something new, something different. Also, of course, he had to be practical because he had a business manager who kept insisting, Mr. Tesla, you have to do something to make some money, because that was a prime concern at that time. He did not have a huge income. He didn't get his retirement income from RCA until 1939. He also had a retirement coming in sometime in the late 30s from his native country, which was then, of course, it was still Serbia, but it had been more or less absorbed by Yugoslavia. He did get a pension from over there, but his primary income after the cutoff from the help from Westinghouse, which goes back into the prior century, which was not Westinghouse's fault, but Tesla tore up the contract to save Westinghouse's ass from being taken over by a certain financial manipulator who wanted to get to control of the Westinghouse Corporation. So he had a very real concern to make money. Many of the things he did, and he had over 400 actual patents issued. Whether they were all practical or not, I don't know. But some of them certainly were. And he even wanted the things like high-frequency lighting without an incandescent lamp. He developed a free energy system, which he did demonstrate on a PSR automobile during this period in 1931-32. He developed a particle beam weapon system, which in 1930, in the period of 31 to 35, he attempted to sell to the United States government. They at first showed interest in the military, then it was turned down for various reasons. Canadian government turned it down, British turned it down, but the Russians bought it. And of course that became one of their primary research weapon systems after World War II was over. And that, of course, is another story we don't need to get into at this point. But Tesla had an insatiable curiosity, and he would go into things, is it possible to do this? And that was his sole criteria. Can you do it? I want to find out. So this really got into the area of the invisibility thing. He didn't have, at that point, a practical application in mind. Roosevelt did, and that's why he was backed by the Navy. Because obviously, if you can make a ship, a tank, a vehicle invisible to anybody, and a potential enemy or whomever you want to make it invisible to, this is a great trick, if you will, a great possible advantage in a war. So that was their view as to why they wanted to push the development. Of course, as we became involved, in fact, before we became involved in World War II, with the British involvement starting in September of 1939, and the German U-boat fleets blockading Britain and cutting off their food supplies, military supplies, and almost everything, including oil, they were in a very hard strait, so they were running the blockade, and the Germans were very efficient at knocking down their ships, quite literally sinking 50% of the shipping. So they were concerned, and we were concerned, of trying to find means for either ambushing the German subs, putting them out of operation in terms of detection, or whatever technique could be used to get the shipping across the Atlantic. 1941, December, of course, on the famous December 7th, we became involved in the war. And then it became a much hotter issue because we started supplying a lot of supplies in our own ships across the Atlantic. And then we started feeling the pinch of the German U-boat fleets. There was a real pressure to try and circumvent the German U-boat fleets. If we can make a fleet invisible, they won't be able to see where we are. We can probably sneak across the Atlantic. So then became a very heavy impetus to make the experiment successful. The first successful test was in September 1940, and it was a Navy ship, a small tender in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It became totally invisible to sight and to a camera. They were not concerned with radar at that point because in 1940, at least as far as the U.S. Navy was concerned, it was still an experimental tool. In about 1938, they started installing experimental systems on various Navy ships to try it out. course, the Army played around with it, and of course the famous reports from Pearl Harbor of the radar picking up the incoming fleet of Japanese planes and the torpedo bombers, which said radar report was totally ignored, I would say to the chagrin of the entire military establishment a few hours later. But they did have means for detecting them then, and of course, as time went on, the systems became much better. The Germans were perhaps ahead of us in radar development, totally independent of the British and American efforts, which were parallel. And they had good radar in their subs. And they were able to pick out the ships. Now, if we could block radar detection, we had then a huge advantage. And that was the reason they pushed on the invisibility thing. We wanted to be radar invisible as well as visually invisible. So the pressure became, after that successful test in September 1940, A, the project was classified. B, it was given a name, Project Rainbow. And C, maximum amount of effort is to be poured into this project to see if we can be successful with a much larger ship than just a tender. Because if it was to be successful, it had to include merchant ships, large military Navy ships, possibly up to the class of a battleship. Depends on what they wanted to put in the convoy. Anything had to be made invisible. So with that first successful test, of course, Tesla went ahead to expand the project, and Roosevelt, of course, said, I'm giving you a battleship to make invisible. If you can make this invisible, you can make anything invisible, and I'll move it into the Philadelphia Navy Yard for you to work on, which he did. Now, this happened in late 1940, and in January, we were attached to the project from January 1940 on, after Duncan and I had finished our school and gone through the 90-day wonder school of the Navy, which was more orientation than anything.
Now, that first ship that they did make invisible,
yes.
How large was it?
It was a small ship, a tender, about 350 tons. Relatively small tender at that, because they have much bigger ones. But to give you a size comparison, the later ships that they were chosen, hand-picked by Dr. von Neumann, for the test were a destroyer escort class, which typically ran around 1,600 tons. They were not very large either, but that was a displacement of 1,600 tons, which in those days was a fairly large ship, but of course no comparison with a cruiser or a battleship. The standard run-of-the-mill type destroyer escorts was what was chosen later on. But they went from the, shall we say, the sublime, a very small ship, to the ridiculous, a battleship, ridiculous in terms of the problems they had. Nothing in between was tested. They decided to go straight and directly to a huge ship, a battleship of about 30,000 tons.
Was anybody on board during the test of that very first?
No, no one was on board, which is important.
Right.
Because in the initial test, they didn't know for sure what would happen. Part of the equipment was on the decks of the tender. They had very heavy electronic gear, which there was quite a bit, but nothing like the later experiments, was all on dockside, and they ran long cables to the ship. The idea was that they didn't want anybody on board the ship because they didn't know what was going to happen. They didn't know what effects might result. They didn't know if they made the ship invisible, if it would ever come back, because they were still a little bit uncertain of the mathematics that were involved. But it became invisible, and it returned when they shut the power off. It was still there. It returned, so to speak. Didn't go anywhere, but again returned to visibility.
So it was all the power externally provided?
External, 100%.
Which is different than...
Much different than the later tests.
Right.
In the case of the battleship, they wanted to have all of the equipment on board the ship, but at the same time, since it was a ship of the line, commissioned and operational, they didn't want to cut holes in the deck and bury equipment below deck. So they decided to leave all of the heavy equipment on the deck and build the various antenna systems, coils and such that were necessary, and just mount them on the deck. Tesla had to contend with the fact that they were going from a test of a 350-ton vehicle with relatively low power to many, many times the power, or an increase in mass of about 100-fold, which meant a power increase of more than tenfold on that from his calculations. He decided to do up to very high-level powers, and that bothered him, Tesla, because he realized as time went on, yes, we could build this equipment, yes, we could mount it on the decks of the battleship,